Debate, the Honourable Member for York South Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to rise in support of this bill from the member from Laval-les-Îles, who has obviously put together something that will be very, very helpful to a lot of the poorest of Canadians, and that is part of what the NDP has pledged to do over all of our years of existence, is to make sure the poorest of Canadians are looked after, that we aren't creating burdens on society that don't belong, that we in fact are dealing with the poorest citizens, and in particular the poorest seniors, in a way that is humane, that is thoughtful, and that is reasonable, and that's what this bill is. Being poor in Canada ought not to be a crime, but sometimes poor people are penalized for things most Canadians take for granted, like the simple thing is putting prepaid funeral expenses forward as part of the way they look after themselves in the future and their families. We sometimes forget the constraints that poor people face in their daily lives. For the 3 million or so Canadians who live below Canada's poverty line, and that's one of the worst records in the G7, finding enough money after paying the rent is a daily challenge. Too often they don't have enough money to feed their children, to look after their health or their future. And it's a sad reality that in a country as rich as ours, there are hundreds of thousands of people who need help putting food on the table, who must rely on food banks, and this is a shame and a travesty. It's said that the inevitable things in life are death and taxes, and I won't talk about the tax increases in the last federal budget, which will hurt poor people more than most, but there is a cost to dealing with the practicalities of death, and that is funeral expenses. And the most prudent way to deal with these expenses is through a prepaid funeral plan. Death comes to poor people as well as to anyone else. But why should the poor be penalized for enlisting in a prepaid funeral expense plan? That is exactly what this government does for the elderly who, due to their poverty, qualify the guaranteed income supplement as part of old age security. And let's understand this. For a single senior to qualify for GIS, your income must be below $16,500 a year. And for a couple, it must be below $21,888 a year. Let's face it, at these income levels, you are poor. So why then does the government penalize those same seniors who withdraw a little bit of money from their RRSP to pay for the inevitable, their funeral, by cutting their GIS benefit? That's what the current law does, and that is simply penalizing the poor. The irony is astounding. This bill would allow those seniors, those self-same seniors, to prepay their funeral expenses with money from an RRSP. This makes sense. It's sensible. This does nothing, absolutely nothing, to change the living conditions of those seniors. This is, in fact, a prudent course of action, a humane and a rational, reasonable, emotional course of action to protect their families in the future from having to deal with some of the tragedy of their death, some of the expenses, some of the emotional turmoil will have been taken care of by the seniors themselves, and who better than to decide how to do that but them? Having an RRSP isn't a crime in this country. Some of these seniors do have RRSPs. The government encourages savings through it, and 47% of seniors on OAS have an RRSP. Surely being poor and dying, as we all do, is not a crime. Using the modest sum, and this is a very, very small amount of money in the grand scheme of things, of $2,500 to pay for funeral expenses should never be considered income in the hands of the senior. But that's what this government is suggesting it is. And that's what, in fact, is the case now. If that person withdraws $2,500 to prepay a funeral expense, that becomes income in that year. Did they themselves receive a benefit from that $2,500? Did they go out and buy a new TV? Did they buy a new car? They can't buy a new car for that. Did they buy an old clunker? Did they do anything to improve their lot in life? No. They are protecting their loved ones from the problems that will face them when those individuals pass away. And that should not be something that is counted as income, and that's what this bill proposes in the calculation of the future GIS. Luckily, I am not, as my NDP colleagues and I, the only one who sees the irony here. An annual income of $16,000 a year for a single senior, who could afford this in another way? They couldn't. Nobody's going to be able to afford to prepay their expenses without dipping into their savings, without dipping into their RSP. The bill stands on its own merits. It's a clear example of the commitment we in the NDP have made to reduce poverty among seniors. And I needn't remind the government that the NDP, in fact, voted against the budget of 2011 because we did not actually take all seniors out of poverty, as Jack Layton and the NDP had suggested to this government in 2010 and 2009 and 2008, that we needed to deal with that. And the government only did a half measure. That half measure was to raise the level of the GIS. Yes, they did do that. Nowhere near enough to get all seniors out of poverty. And then, 2 years later, or the next year, take all the money back by telling seniors they can't retire until they're 67 anyway. So, and actually take more than that money back. So we have a government that gives with one hand and takes it back with the other. That is the irony of this situation, Mr. Speaker, is that these seniors are the poorest of the poor in the seniors' world. And yet, this government would continue to, would suggest, as the parliamentary secretary has already suggested, they will vote against this bill. Some of them, anyway. She will. It is a private member's bill, and then it's up to each individual member, which, on the basis of some fabricated cost, in fact, only those seniors who actually have an RSP and only those seniors who actually decide to do this will benefit. They will not actually themselves benefit. What will happen is the government will save, will continue to pay them what they've been paying them already. So we're not talking about a cost. We're talking about a reduction in tax savings that the government is taking from these seniors. They're actually taking money out of the pockets of seniors who do this in the year following their use of this money to prepay their funeral expenses. That's what the government is currently doing, is taking money out of the pockets of seniors. We're suggesting that these are the poorest of seniors to begin with. We should not be taking money out of their pockets in subsequent years. The minister has suggested this is an outrageous and exorbitant amount of money. Our calculations are about 1,000 times less than the minister's own calculations, Mr. Speaker. And our calculations, I feel, are much more accurate and much more closely reflect what it will mean when they stop taking money out of the pockets of seniors. This money, we're not suggesting this money shouldn't be taxable, so that if a senior who withdraws money from their RSP, none of those rules would change. There is no huge administrative expense to this. There's no enormous burden. This is a simple and effective way to allow seniors to plan their death. And that's something that all seniors should have the dignity and the care of the rest of Canadians to do. We firmly believe that this is part of an overall policy of making sure that the people who built this great country, our seniors, are in fact looked after in the best and most humane way. We were unsuccessful in convincing the government to lift them all out of poverty, and we were unsuccessful so far, but in 2015 we'll change that, in convincing the government to back off on making them wait till they're 67 before they get any of this money. That 2-year wait will cause untold harm on a number of seniors in this country. But we can and should take this simple and straightforward approach and this simple and straightforward measure of ensuring that seniors who want to plan their death have the ability to do so without costing them out of pocket the following year as the government takes money back from them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.